Good afternoon, everyone. 36 years ago, when our Prime Minister was a fellow named Pierre Trudeau, our country was embarking on an exciting and controversial process of creating its first constitutional Charter of Rights. And that Charter of Rights, when it was introduced before Parliament, had any number of important rights, including a guarantee of equality in Section 15. But the guarantee of equality in Section 15 was written in a way so that it did not include equality for people with disabilities. Not only didn't include it, but it was written in a way where courts couldn't read it in. This led a number of us, me then a law student, many of us across the country to be motivated to get into action. We fought for and ultimately campaigned for and won, collectively, an amendment to the Charter of Rights before it was enacted to include equality rights for people with disabilities. Made Canada really a leader around the world for its day. But 36 years later, how's it working? Do people with disabilities in Canada experience equality? Are we fully included in our society? Well, just looking at the federal sphere alone, the answer is a resounding no. There are a pervasive number of barriers that impede people with disabilities, whether your disability is a physical one, a mental one, a sensory disability, an intellectual disability, a learning disability, a mental health disability, whatever kind of disability it is, you face barriers when you try to avail yourself of the goods or services or facilities offered to us by the federal government or organizations that the federal government can regulate or influence. When you go get yourself a cable TV service, you can get yourself a PVR to choose what channels to watch, record, and watch them. Except if you're blind or dyslexic, you can't read what's on the screen. Federal laws in the states have required cable companies to provide an accessible PVR. In Canada, one company, to my knowledge, provides one. Another is at least talked to us about starting to provide one, but they're not pervasive. When you turn on your computer, being able to go online and surf to get access to goods and services from companies, from the federal government or from organizations the federal government can regulate or influence, you'll find that a lot of them offer information and services on their websites, but there's no assurance that they are accessible to the technology that people with disabilities use to be able to read them. In fact, a decade ago, a colleague and friend, Donna Jodhan, had to sue the federal government under the Charter of Rights to try to get an order to force them to comply with whatever the accessibility standards the government itself proclaimed for itself, but wasn't then following. Federal government fought, she won, they appealed, she won again. When you go to take part in travel that the federal government can regulate, whether it's air travel, interprovincial train travel, barriers face passengers with disabilities to this day. Even though there's a regulatory agency, the Canadian Transportation Agency, that's had power and a mandate to try to address that, it's done it ineffectively. The barriers go on and on. Well, commendably, in the last federal election 2 years ago, the son of Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau, when campaigning for office, made a promise in response to inquiries from those of us from the disability community. We asked if he would provide, if elected, whether he would enact a new national accessibility law. One that would make the rights guaranteed to us in the Charter of Rights and the Canadian Human Rights Act a reality. Make them work. And he said yes. So did the Green Party and so did the New Democrats. The question that I'd like to address to you today is, what should that law include? Commendably, the federal government's had a national consultation on what it should include. It's had roundtables on what it should include, and I've had the privilege of taking part in them. And it's going to introduce a bill into Parliament within the next couple of months. So we as a community need to be ready to look at it and see what it includes and whether it has everything we need. I'm going to take you through some suggestions of what I think it needs. In Canada embarking on this, we are joining an international trend where we have fallen way behind. Way behind. In 1990, the US passed the Americans with Disabilities Act and started a trend that has spread to a good number of countries around the world and led other countries around the world to more and more look into the idea of passing their own national accessibility legislation. Similarly, over a decade ago, the United Nations passed the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. Canada signed it, but our lack of a national accessibility law has meant that we're not living up to what we need to do. Well, before I talk to you about what the law should include, I need to spend a couple of minutes on what the problem is that it's trying to solve. Well, the problem, as I just illustrated, is that we people with disabilities live in a world full of barriers. Some of them are old, they've been around for a long time, like some older buildings. Some of them are new, like this law school where I'm speaking to you right now, where they renovated the building and made it, frankly, worse, much worse, for a blind person like me to find our way around. Some of the problems are old because we're using old technology, and some of them arise from new technology that we can't deal with. Many of them could be fixed at low cost, and all of them could be prevented at little or no cost. Why do we build the world this way? The buildings, the laws, the technology, the services. We do it because too often organizations tend to target what they do for what they think is the average person, the average consumer, the average customer, the average student. But the average customer or student in this fictional world, since none of us are that average person, they typically don't have a disability. We design a world historically and operate it as if people with disabilities just aren't there. This is an absurdity because people with disabilities are not only there, but we're everywhere. If you don't have a disability now, you're going to get one later as you age. We are the minority of everyone. And so this idea of designing a world as if people with disabilities are not there is ridiculous. And a law that would change that is a law that would help everybody. Well, a law. Don't we have a law in the books? Don't we have any laws? And the answer is, hey, we actually have a whole lot of laws. I'm now just talking about the federal sphere. I'm not talking about what's going on at the provincial level, but within the range of of the federal sphere, we've had the Charter of Rights since 1982, which guarantees a constitutional right to equality at the hands of the government and government agencies and organizations implementing government programs. That's really important. Since the early 80s, the Canadian Human Rights Act has banned discrimination within the federal sphere. But there's more. The Canadian Transportation Agency has parallel human rights provisions and powers to enforce it. Similarly, within the area of transportation that the federal government can regulate, like air travel or interprovincial train travel. Well, moreover, when it comes to areas like broadcast or telecommunication services, telephone, cell phones, and so on, the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, CRTC, it too has had a power in this area. And yet, whatever action those agencies have taken, the CRTC, the CTA have taken, it's been too little and it's not working. Yeah, we've made some progress. I'm not saying they're doing nothing, but on their own, they're not working. These laws don't work for several reasons. They haven't solved our problem. Old barriers aren't coming down fast enough. New ones aren't being prevented with great enough reliability for several reasons. The first thing is that in many cases, they don't provide detailed specificity to organizations of what exactly they got to do. They speak often in general terms. The Charter of Rights says it guarantees equality and forbids discrimination, but that doesn't tell the government what their website should look like. Human Rights Code, the same thing. And too often that's the case with regulatory legislation too. Moreover, these laws largely, not all of them, but require individuals to litigate barriers one at a time. Most people with disabilities won't or can't afford to, and in the federal sphere, often who they're up against are the likes of Government of Canada or Bell Canada or Rogers or Via Rail or so on. Big airlines. It's quite an unfair match. But there are other reasons that there's a problem with their working. To the extent that they've delegated this to different agencies, that means that people with disabilities have to run all over the place. Do I go to the Human Rights Commission? Part of it may go to the Canadian Transportation Agency. Oh, this one goes over to the CRTC. It's great for regulatory, it's great for big companies because they can keep you running in circles, but not great for you if you're trying to get your rights enforced. And finally, the problem with having different regulatory agencies divide this up rather than having one-stop shopping is they tend to have a little bit too close a relationship with the industries they regulate. And therefore, not enough of a relationship with the people with disabilities who they should be serving in this context. So there's one more reason why we're in the pickle we're in. And that is, we've learned, we folks in the disability community and advocacy world, that the most commonly articulated aphorism of how to solve this actually doesn't work. A lot of people say, well, the problem is not that people have it against you guys. It's just they don't know any better. They're not leaving you out or creating barriers intentionally. It's just they never thought of it. So we just got to raise awareness. So, but we've tried raising awareness for years, for decades. It sometimes convinces some people to do the right thing, but even then, if it does, they may not be the person in the organization with the authority to do the right thing. They may get overruled by somebody higher up in the organization. Raising awareness doesn't work as the solution. It can help, but it is not the solution. It is not predominantly the solution. And yet it's been the focus of a great deal of comment and proposals and so on. So what do we need? Well, let me summarize and let me go into details. What we need is a comprehensive new law that will implement the rights that the Charter of Rights and the Human Rights Code federally guarantee to us as people with disabilities, that provides the specificity that obligated organizations need so they know what they got to do, and that is enforced without us as individuals having to be private accessibility cops individually fighting barriers one at a time. Now, we got experience with this. They've done this to some extent in the United States under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Ontario in 2005 commendably passed the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. I had the privilege of leading the decade-long campaign to get that law enacted, and have been leading the campaign in recent years to try to get it effectively implemented. Similarly, Manitoba passed a comparable law, the Accessibility for Manitobans Act, in 2013, and then last year, Nova Scotia did the same. But we don't have anything in the other provinces, and we don't have anything nationally. This law needs to have a number of key ingredients. I'm just going to mention some. I'm then going to explore them in some detail with you over the next few minutes. It needs to have the goal of achieving a fully accessible Canada to the extent the federal government can do it. A core feature in it, which I'll speak more about, is it should mandate and require the creation and the enforcement of a series of accessibility regulations that we'd call accessibility standards that tell obligated organizations exactly what they got to do. Not in vague terms, but in really specific, clear terms. It should be effectively, publicly enforced. It should use all the levers of power that the federal government can get its hands on to promote its goals. Importantly, it should be operated in a way that net makes us money, that saves the public taxpayer and benefits obligated organizations because they're going to get a greater pool of employees and customers. And, this is very important, anything it does should only advance the rights of people with disabilities. Nothing in it should slow things down or weaken their rights. How do we do that? Well, what I'm going to propose draws on what we've learned in Ontario, and I was there at the table negotiating for the contents of that legislation and been involved in the fight to get it effectively implemented since, so I'm in a position to know a lot about that. What we've learned in other provinces, what we learned from the states, and what we've learned from other countries. Let me dig in to the core ingredients based on that overall summary. First, we got to be clear what the purpose of the law is. It should set out its purpose in clear terms. And that purpose, as I said, should be to ensure that Canada becomes, to the extent the federal government can get us there, fully accessible to people with disabilities by a deadline that it sets. Now, I'm not naming a specific deadline. I think that's something we got to negotiate. The provincial government in Ontario back in 2005 said 2025, gave the province 20 years. I think that was a good idea. Some thought it was too short. Nobody thought it was too long. But in any event, the idea of a deadline starts the clock ticking. It leads us all to say, are we on schedule? Are we moving quickly enough? It lets the government look at this, but it lets individual organizations also say, what's our plan for getting to full accessibility by that deadline? It is important that in framing that purpose, that we not use mushy words. It's not good enough to say the purpose of the law is to improve accessibility. While I'm very complimentary of the federal government's openness to input and its open consultations it's conducted, there's some areas that I've had some that I propose in my coalition has had some difficulties. They initially proposed that the purpose of a national accessibility law would be improving accessibility. We say that sounds good, but it's way too weak. One ramp in Red Deer, Alberta, and we've achieved the law's goal. One new accessible website is somewhere in the Northwest Territories, and we've improved accessibility. Not much, but some. Our goal has to be not just improving accessibility, but achieving accessibility. Anything else and it becomes kind of mushy words that either bureaucrats or others will hide behind to justify doing little, and certainly not enough. Similarly, it's not enough to frame it as the goal is to substantially improve accessibility or make Canada the most accessible country. Those are kind of words that make things sound good, but they don't work. We've learned in Ontario, the goal has got to be accessibility, and commendable that the Ontario government set that goal, though criticism of the Ontario government for not doing enough to achieve it, bits of that will come up over the next few minutes. The final thing is, in terms of framing the purpose, it should be in relation not only to federally regulated companies and organizations, but in relation to any organization that the federal government can reach. And you're going to hear in a few minutes some ideas of how the federal government could have a significant impact even within provincial jurisdiction without violating provincial jurisdiction. Well, how do you do this? How do you achieve this goal? Well, one, and I can talk a lot about substantive legal stuff because the legal rights are actually set out in the Charter and the Canadian Human Rights Act, but there are two really important operative terms that need to be defined, and they need to be defined broadly: disability and barrier. Because any accessibility standards that are created, any enforcement steps, any action on anything I'm going to talk to you about this afternoon will hinge on how they're defined. More or less, the Ontario legislation has done it well. They should both be broadly defined. In terms of disability, my suggestion is that it should indicate that it's any disability, whether it's caused by birth, injury, illness, or aging. Our human rights codes haven't used the term or aging. In fact, the Ontario's accessibility law doesn't either, but I think that's a great addition. Similarly, I think they should list a number of the conditions known to be covered. Now, some may critique that within the disability community by saying that's more of a medical model of disability, it's contingent on diagnoses. My answer is this: it shouldn't be limited to that list of conditions, but it should include them, because if you are not a lawyer and you are not a disability expert and you have to implement this law in your business or your government department, you should be able to look at the definition of disability and go, autism is there? Okay, I got to do something about it. Blindness is there, using a service animal is there, whatever it may be. The list may be long and it may not be, there may be conditions we haven't yet contemplated, but by listing them, as part of the definition, that will ensure that people using this law will know for a certainty, without having to get all lawyered up, what they got to do. Similarly, definition of barrier needs to be a broad one. It should be anything which can impede you from fully participating due to your disability in the goods, services, facilities, or employment or other opportunities that the organization can provide. And it's really important to be clear with examples of barriers, again, not meant to be exhaustive or definitive. Because many lay people looking at this legislation, when they hear accessibility, they think of stairs to get into a building, built environment barriers. And while they're important, they're not the only ones. And we got to make it clear that the full spectrum of barriers are covered. Everything else I'm going to talk to you about now is about designing the implementation strategy for this. Literally everything else. So the first of the many implementation strategy I want to propose, this law should have, is that it should, this is a huge heading, put someone in charge. What we've learned, both at the provincial level and within individual organizations and companies, is that you make way more progress on accessibility if there's someone in charge. At the government level, we need a minister who is responsible for leading the regulatory implementation of the Act, bringing forward the regulations and so on, and another minister who is separately responsible for leading the government's actual compliance with the Act. The compliance minister can have other responsibilities, but they certainly have to have one person where the buck stops. The Prime Minister needs to have one person he or she can turn to and say, are we doing everything we should be doing? And so on. Similarly, within organizations, we've learned that they need to have, if they're large enough, and federally regulated companies are often very large, they need to have a chief accessibility officer in charge, reporting to the top. IBM in the States has one, Microsoft has one, Apple has one. It's a model that helps, that's been proven to work. But nationally, the in charge should first be the federal government, and within the federal government, designated officials, both elected and public servant officials. It's not good enough to have a law that just says full accessibility is our goal in 20 years or 15 years. It's absolutely important that it indicate that the government is the body that's mandated to lead us there. That's their job. That's what the Ontario law does, and it's commendable. Now, that doesn't mean you expect the government to go out and tear down every flight of stairs and any organization that the feds can regulate. No, that's not how it works. The law would then go on to spell out what the federal government needs to do to fulfill its job to lead us to the goal that it sets. And that, in turn, is where I will be spending the rest of my time. But in spelling out that roadmap or series of obligations, it also should build in accountability features, I'll offer you some, and recourse for us, the public, if they don't live up to their obligations that are imposed on the government in its role to lead us there. So the government has two roles. It's got to lead our society there, but within as much as the federal government can, and it's got to bring its own house in order. One is more of a regulatory role, and the second is a compliance role. So, what should be on that menu of its obligations? Let me spend our time on that. The first of these is that the federal government should be required to enact a series of regulations, as I earlier said, to be called accessibility standards, which will spell out either on a sector-by-sector basis or on an activity-by-activity basis what an organization has to do specifically and when they got to do it by. They could set different rules for bigger organizations than smaller organizations, for the public sector versus the private sector, but they should be the kind of regulations that an obligated organization, whether it's the Department of the federal government or it's Air Canada or Rogers, can turn to and say, okay, this is what we got to do. Hopefully it will be, if they're done right, It will all be stuff that they would, if wise, say, this is all stuff we should be doing anyway. So what makes, what areas could they make them in? And how many should they make? Well, I borrow from Ontario that has set a good legislative model. It provides that the provincial government not only may make access standards, but it must. And then it goes on to not just provide that it must make access standards, but it actually specifies that the Ontario government must make all the accessibility standards needed to achieve the purpose of the law. What that means is, if the Ontario government were to do its job, it would make enough accessibility standards so that if they were fully complied with, we would achieve full accessibility by 2025. Same should be the case for the National Accessibility Law. Whatever deadline it sets for achieving that goal, it should be required to make all the accessibility standards needed to ensure that we achieve that goal. And it's an unusual design. Most laws that allow a government to create regulations don't require it, and the rare time they require it don't quantify how many. Here we should. What areas could they make them in? Well, Ontario's made several that, while I would criticize them as being too weak, they are in areas that are really good choices. They've addressed some of them by subject matter. One is in the area of transportation accessibility. They've agreed to now do one in the area of healthcare and another one in the area of education. And others they've done are in the area of more broad categories of activity that cut across all sectors of the economy. They've created an accessibility standard addressing accessible customer service, employment, access to information communication, like websites, and part, though certainly nowhere near all, of the built environment. So of those, several would fit the federal sphere. Customer service would, employment would, information communication would, for example, and the built environment certainly would. To what extent the federal government would address healthcare, we'll talk about in a few minutes in a different context. But there are other areas that we could envisage effective federal regulatory standards being made that are specifically federal. Accessible banking services would be a good one. Accessible telephone and telecommunication services, wireless services, and so on. Similarly, accessibility of air travel and any travel that the federal government can regulate. Accessibility of broadcast. How much closed captioning we get on our TV programming, or for those of us who are blind, audio described TV programming, are just some examples that I would offer. So, and I can imagine more. But those are the kinds of areas. So what should an accessibility standard include? Well, if it's done right, you'd pick it up and read it. It would tell you what kind of barriers you've got to address and what you got to do to address them. Sometimes they can be so detailed as to tell you exactly what to do, like how high a counter height should be to be accessible. In others, it may adopt international requirements, like for website accessibility. If there's a good international standard, you can just opt in and employ that. But it should lead an organization to be able to ask the question, what the heck do I have to do? And look at the standard and get the answer with as much clarity as possible. Organizations will like that so they don't have to reinvent the wheel. People with disabilities will like that because we'll know what to expect and what we are entitled to ask for without having to go through some long constitutional argument or human rights argument just to set the standard. That kind of legal argument is very cool in a law school class or in a law journal article. And as a lawyer who might want to argue one of those, it's a lot of fun to do. But the folks who need these barriers removed need these barriers removed. And a clear, specific regulation is going to do a way better job than leaving it to long, protracted litigation that most can't afford. What standard do we apply to the standards? Well, my proposal is that standards enacted under this legislation should aspire to fully implement the rights that people with disabilities enjoy under the Charter of Rights and the Canadian Human Rights Act. Now, They may not be able to cover every last barrier, and you still may have to file an individual human rights complaint in some offbeat setting that the regulation didn't contemplate. But at the very least, a company or a government department should be able to have confidence that if they've complied with the standard, they've complied with the Charter and the Human Rights Code. The problem with the regulatory standards that have been passed in Ontario, the accessibility standards, is for the most part, they are too weak, so that a company that brings themselves, or a government department, or a school board that brings themselves into compliance may well still be exposed to a human rights or charter complaint, depending if they're public or private sector, because they may not have done everything they need to do. And because nothing under this National Accessibility Act can or should ever take our rights away, we would never condone a system that said, well, as long as you complied with these federal regulatory standards, you are free of complaints under the Charter, no matter how weak the federal standards are. Rather, what we should aspire to is having the government enacting accessibility standards under national accessibility law, which are strong enough that they meet or exceed the Charter and human rights threshold that organizations have to fulfill anyway. Well, after you make these standards, are they done? No. Periodically, they should be reviewed. Under Ontario's law, it's every 5 years. That makes sense to see if either things have changed. We passed a standard that governs website accessibility in 2011. It was quite good for its day, not quite as good as I'd like, but quite good. But since then, we've got new things that have come along. Websites practices have changed. Mobile apps have come along. Now that regulation is now being reviewed provincially, and it's good that it is because it gives us a chance to expand it. So then comes the next huge question, if we're going to have these accessibility standards. How do you make them? Where do they come from? Pluck them out of the air? What do you do? Well, let me take a few minutes to just talk to you about that, and then we're going to take a break. A good national accessibility law should detail how these standards are made, and there's several propositions I'd like to offer. Ultimately, they've got to be enacted by cabinet, by the government. You can't take that away from them. But there's just a few important points I want to offer you. A practice from the US, from Ontario, and elsewhere that has evolved, and I think is, if done right, is a good idea, is that first the government should set up advisory committees that can advise on what a proposed standard should include. Committees that can consult the public sector, the private sector, and people with disabilities, get their input, and give their best advice. Their proposals should be made public for the government to consider, and then the government can act on their advice or vary it. Now that is a general proposition I stand behind, and it is a common feature of the US Americans with Disabilities Act and Ontario's, Manitoba's, and Nova Scotia's laws. But I part company with Ontario's law, and indeed the other Canadian laws, by saying that what the federal government should do is have the advisory process, the design and operation of these advisory committees, it should be made completely arm's length from the government. In Ontario, it's completely overseen by the government. In contrast, the US has the National Access Board that, while it's federally funded, operates quite arm's length from the government. And I think they do a far better job. What happens here is the government in Ontario is the government tries to control it. They may have a political agenda of trying to water it down, or may feel beholden to obligated organizations more than people with disabilities, and it weakens the effectiveness of the province. We've seen significant problems in how they develop accessibility standards in Ontario as compared to the United States. So it's absolutely important for it to be arm's length, the process of deciding what standards to make and the operating of expert advisory committees to produce the best independent advice. What government does with that advice in the end is for the government to decide and face its political accountability. But I think that we'd get better regulations if we got better arm's length advice. And just to give you a couple of illustrations of the kind of problems that can occur, and we'll take the break. In Ontario, it seems, the government is increasingly trying to cloak the standards development process, or at least the operation of its standards development committee, in secrecy. I went and appeared before its Transportation Standards Development Committee in Ontario a couple of months ago, thanks to some able help from a couple of students from Osgoode doing research to assist, to present some proposals. I walked in and the first thing the chair of the committee said is, "This is a confidential meeting." I said, "No, it isn't." I pointed to provisions in the Act that says that they have to keep minutes, make them public, and so on. And I just thought there's a real disconnect here between what they're doing and what they should be doing. We need an open process and an arm's length process. To that end, one core proposal that we've put forward is that the federal government should create a new agency called the National or Canada Accessibility Commissioner. And one of his or her important jobs should be to operate the process of developing recommendations for accessibility standards. And that commissioner, federally funded, should report to Parliament and should be able to operate quite independently without being subject to the vicissitudes of either political interference or public servant control. I said a couple of examples. I'm going to give you one more example, and then we'll take our break. In Ontario, it's the government that decides whether to even appoint a committee to start developing an accessibility standard. We, years ago, proposed that we needed ones in the area of healthcare and education, and it literally took years to get the government to agree. An independent National Accessibility Commissioner might well be able to make those decisions more quickly. The government could always propose a topic, but even if the government doesn't, an objective, independent National Accessibility Commissioner should have the power to say, you know what, we need a new standard in a particular area, and I'm appointing a committee to give at least advice on what it should include. With that, let's take a break, and then we'll come back to talk about what else the national accessibility law would need to make this actually work effectively. Well, let me actually fill in just a little more detail about how you develop accessibility standards before I jump into the critical topic of how the heck you enforce these things. First, a question about who, and then a question about how. In Ontario, they appoint individual standards development committees ad hoc, which is understandable to deal with areas where people are experts, but they're not arm's length from the government. And in fact, currently, government staff sit on the committee as non-voting members. And I've said already why it's really important for them to be arm's length. In the case of the federal government, just like the provincial government, government's going to likely be, or will be, the largest respondent that's got to comply. It's important that whatever the committee proposes, the government hears the advice independently. This got out of control in Ontario a couple years ago, where after they agreed to do a healthcare standard, but before they even appointed an advisory committee to advise on what it should include, the government held what they called a pre-consultation to decide what should be the scope of what it should include, which is like, let's have a consultation before we appoint people to give us advice and do a consultation. It just, A, it drags out the process, and B, it smacks of a government that's busy trying to control every inch of the way rather than just get good advice. Again, I emphasize, whatever advice they get, the government gets the final say on what they're going to enact. But we think it'll, and I certainly think that you get a better product when you get good arm's length advice that the government can have input into, but isn't controlling that whole process. But there's a second part of the who that is unique to the situation with the legislation that the federal government's going to be introducing. The federal government, as I said, did an excellent broad public consultation between 2016 and 2017 across the country. And before they started, they issued a discussion guide to give an idea of what they'd like to hear about, which was very helpful. But in one area, it took a position that that I have real difficulty with, and I'm still very concerned about. And that is this. It proposed that the idea that in the areas that the Canadian Transportation Agency now covers, the Canadian Transportation Agency should still be in charge. And for the areas that the CRTC covers, broadcast, telecommunication, all that sort of stuff, telephone, cable TV, cable services, all that, internet, they too should retain authority. If anything, I think what the federal government has said it's considering is giving them more power in those areas. And I take a different view. I think that the National Accessibility Commissioner, or whichever arm's length body is created to make recommendations on the content of access standards, that body should have authority over all the areas that the federal government can address. We shouldn't carve out chunks of it and say it goes to the Canadian Transportation Agency or CRTC. And I say that for several reasons. First, people with disabilities should have one-stop shopping. And when it comes to developing accessibility standards, it should include one stop for getting the changes made that we need. We shouldn't have to run around the country and get punted from one agency to the next. As it is, if you file a human rights complaint alleging discrimination against a phone company, you may find that you get punted by the Human Rights Commission over the CRTC, depending how the events unfold. And it's better for it all to be under one roof. And the one roof it's under should be an organization that has expertise in disability and accessibility. Now, that's not to say you would shut the CTA or the CRTC out. If the federal government was going to make a national transportation accessibility standard, then its Canada Accessibility Commissioner, or whatever arm's length body it mandates to do it, could certainly work together with the CTA, could get their input and so on. But if the CTA resists, that shouldn't, or tries to water it down, but the Canada Accessibility Commissioner, which whoever's got the final word on what's going to be recommended to the federal government, that agency, if that arm's length body wants to recommend more or better or stronger, it should do so. Cabinet can, of course, get input from the CTA and decide who's making the best case, but the CTA shouldn't have a final veto on it. Put another way, the Canadian Transportation Agency and the CRTC have already had a mandate in these areas for years, and their track record is not sufficient. And I don't believe their insufficiency of their accomplishments has been because they didn't have enough power. Now, there may be more powers that would let them do more than they could do now, but there's a lot more they could do now under the powers they've got. And I, for one, don't believe in going back to an organization with a track record of not doing enough and just saying, let's give you more power that you may not use to supplement the current power that you haven't effectively used. And I mean, I'm excited that in the face of, and perhaps because of, I don't know, the movement that many of us are involved in pushing for national accessibility legislation, that the Canadian Transportation Agency in the last year got religion and is trying to develop stronger accessibility standards in transportation. That's great. No problem. Happy you're finally seeing the light. But we can't just wait for that. There's another reason we don't want to park the final word on what to propose at the CRTC or the CTA. You may, in this course on administrative law, have heard the term before, or may not, and the term is regulatory capture. Regulatory capture is a description of a phenomenon that exists here and in many other countries, Western democracies, where you have a regulatory state, where the regulatory body has a relationship with the industry it regulates, which is not completely arm's length. I'm not alleging corruption or anything nefarious, but frankly, whether it's employees who go from the regulated industry to the regulatory agency and back through a revolving door, or whether it's because of an ongoing day-to-day working relationship, or whether it's just because the industry is much richer than others and therefore able to spend more time and money making its case to the staff of the regulatory agency. The fact of the matter is that I am concerned that the CTA would not have the kind of independence from the industries it regulates and the fortitude, and the same with the CRTC. And that's not to impugn any individuals or again to allege any misconduct. But this is something, I didn't invent the idea of regulatory capture. I learned about it when I was in law school, and through my career I've seen it in different regulatory regimes over and over, here and in the States and elsewhere. So a concern about it, I would expect that the CRTC would want to retain all of its power and even get more in this area, and so would the CTA. That's what those kinds of organizations do. And I would expect their industries they regulate would far rather them have this mandate than some new organization like a Canada Accessibility Commissioner, which has a stronger core commitment to and expertise in accessibility and maybe more ability to get input from the disability community. So for those purposes and those reasons, I think that Canada would be better off either simply giving this mandate to the National Accessibility Commissioner or whoever is going to have the role of arm's length advice giving on what to include in accessibility standard, or if they're going to leave any authority with the CRTC or CTA, it shouldn't be final authority, and it should be open if the CRTC is doing nothing or not doing enough for this new accessibility advisory agency to be able to act on its own, give its advice to cabinet, invite government to get input from the CRTC or CTA, as the case may be, but nevertheless not enable them to lock it up. The other couple of words I want to say about how we develop accessibility standards relates to who's at the table. Now, what we've done in Ontario, what's happened in Ontario, commendably, is that they include representation from the disability sector and from the obligated sector. And that's the way it should be. They fill the room with a number of public servants who don't have voting standards. I don't mind these committees getting input from government officials at an appropriate time, but I really don't like the idea that they're populating the committee on everything except votes, because I think it really slants the process unfairly, or could be seen to. For example, when I appeared before the Transportation Standards Development Committee, the majority of people in the room were either from the transit sector or non-voting government officials. And the message conveyed was that this is a process that predominates that way. And when you see the recommendations that they proposed for initial circulation, ones we've responded to, again, with the help of some fabulous Osgoode students who helped with our research, they were quite one-sided and not in favor of the needs of people with disabilities. But the other thing, and to the credit of the Ontario government, and a decade ago in the 2007 election, we pointed out that there's a lopsidedness. And what the government agreed to was that it would ensure that on any standards development committee, half of the voting members are from the disability sector. And that is, I think, an important step forward. It's not in the legislation, but they promised it, and they acted on that promise. I think it would be better if they acted on that promise and also made sure that the committee wasn't the majority, that the equal number of people in the room were people with disabilities, the other side, the obligated sector, and they could bring in government representatives when they need them, but not have them there the whole time, lest that makes the situation less arm's length than it should be. But the other thing that we've learned, and we've learned this from a number of jurisdictions, not just Ontario, but even when you have equal representation at the table, there isn't an equality of power. Because on one side of the power, you've got a Transportation Standards Development Committee, and on one side you're going to have people representing major public transit authorities, that's municipally funded public sector, or Metrolinx in the case of Ontario, which is part of the Ontario government, or whatever. And on the other side, you'll have some individuals from the disability community, maybe some staff from volunteer community disability organizations. One side, their whole way is essentially being paid by the taxpayer, and the other side is basically volunteer or charitable money. One side with access to all sorts of research capabilities, the other side not. We got the provincial government in the 2007 election to promise to provide staff support for the disability sector representatives. That helped, though from what I'm seeing now, it's not clear they're still doing that. Some situations I know they didn't. And again, it makes the situation lopsided. I'd like to see in a national accessibility law a more structured regime under this arm's length body, whether it's the National Accessibility Commission or whatever we want to call them, which provides the kind of staff and research support to the disability sector so the playing field at the table is a level one. You'll get better advice. So with that, let me now move from the already substantial and complicated area of how you develop accessibility standards. Let me move to the question of how do you enforce this thing? Because the next key ingredient in this legislation is that it has to provide for effective enforcement. And the Ontario government, if we learn from their experience, well, there's lots we can learn from their experience. They were right when they enacted this legislation in 2005 to say enforcement is key, that if people don't believe that there are consequences and meaningful consequences, that they're simply not going to comply enough of the time. And that we've learned this from everything from seatbelt laws to all sorts of other legislation, time and again. And the Ontario government is to be commended for promising effective enforcement. But there's lots we can learn also from the Ontario government in what they've done since then, which is a complete, change the word from complete to, a significant failure to keep their commitment, that their enforcement has been inadequate and to some extent could be described as paltry relative to the levels of non-compliance of which they're aware and which they could do much more about. So what should effective enforcement look like? Well, when you're doing creating a regulatory statute, there's room for a lot of creativity. There's several pieces that we know about. You can and should have a power to levy monetary penalties and stiff ones to make non-compliance seem not worth it. Especially when you're regulating giants like Air Canada or Rogers Communication. I'm not picking on them, but just as illustrations. Or the federal government, you need quantities of money that are going to send the right signal. But you also need other things. You need compliance orders. So if there's non-compliance, an order can be issued that says, here's what you got to do. It can specify what needs to be done and can specify by when and can be readily measured. By the way, the clearer the accessibility standard, the easier to enforce. The more detail in the accessibility standard, if it tells us you got to have a counter at this height, you can easily tell if they're in compliance. Take out a tape measure. In Ontario, unfortunately, they passed a regulation that said for public surface areas, you should have an accessible counter height, but they don't say what that is, which is bad for organizations that want to know what the heck to do, and bad for enforcement who have to figure out what they should, when to enforce, bad for people with disabilities who could be left with all sorts of inconsistent practices. When it comes to enforcement, the clearer the rules, the easier the enforcement. And likely, the easier it is to get change in what people actually do, and that is, after all, what we're all about. The next key thing when it comes to enforcement is there should be a regime of public audits, inspections, and public reporting so that organizations don't have to wait for someone to prove noncompliance. They should be motivated by a concern that if they're inspected or audited, it would reveal noncompliance and could lead to consequences. And self-reporting, requiring public self-reporting about what they've done, especially if it has to be posted online, provides for another key tool, which is the capacity for crowdsourcing enforcement. If an organization has to file an accessibility self-report, has to detail what it's done, and if it's required to be posted online and made accessible to the public, that would allow us to check things out even if public officials aren't. Another key ingredient for enforcement is there needs to be a complaints process. And I don't by that mean a formal legal complaints process like under a human rights code where you file a complaint and you proceed as an individual complainant to a hearing and adjudication, more along the lines of what we have with the police than the criminal law. You're aware of law breaking, you report it to the police. The police have limited resources, they exercise their discretion, where to allocate those scarce resources. But at least their discretion can be informed by what's reported. And if there's a serious report of a serious accessibility problem right now, that would provide an avenue for the government, or the enforcer, I should say, to deploy its accessibility resources immediately if the public complaint is a credible one and the violation looks like it's a serious one in an important area. But underlying all of these agreed ingredients of effective enforcement is one overarching theme, which is that the enforcement must be in the charge of a public sector organization which is arm's length from the federal government. And to that end, I and my coalition, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance, we have actually proposed that that too should be part of the mandate of the National or Canada Accessibility Commissioner. Now, they may assign it somewhere else, but the key thing is it should be an organization that is arm's length from and independent from the government. Having enforcement in the same hands as the organization that is developing recommendations for accessibility standards is helpful because their experience with enforcement will enrich their thinking on what to recommend for accessibility standards, and their experience in developing accessibility standards will enrich their enforcement activity and expertise. Why should it be an arm's length body? One principle, one practical. The one in principle is that as I said earlier, the largest organization that's going to have to comply with this law is going to be the federal government. And as a matter of principle, the federal government shouldn't be expected, credibly, to enforce its own law against itself. Its stronger interest is going to be in giving itself a break. As a practical matter, I will tell you that we know in Ontario that they don't have independent enforcement. Enforcement is in the hands of an office called the Accessibility Directorate of Ontario. It's part of the Ministry of, that's now called the Ministry of Accessibility. It reports directly to a deputy minister and a minister. And we have years of experience to show that enforcement has been way too lax. Way too lax. And indeed, we have a situation now where the same minister is both responsible for government services, compliance, having the government comply with the law, and the Accessibility Directorate, the ministry responsible for enforcing the law. And we think no matter how committed the minister is, no matter how dedicated to accessibility the minister is, you can't wear both of those hats. And you can't have both of those hats reporting to you. So both as a matter of principle and from years of practical experience, we know that this enforcement needs to be arm's length and independent of the government. Well, what would help make enforcement work? We know that any government is going to have limited enforcement resources. So I'd like to suggest that it would be good to creatively craft the enforcement process to get the most bang for your enforcement buck. And by that, I mean this. First, having an effective, widely publicized toll-free hotline to file complaints and making public on a monthly or quarterly basis what the input that's come in that way would help provide an avenue for crowdsourced enforcement. As I said just a few minutes ago, requiring obligated organizations, especially government departments and large corporations, like Via Rail or one of the cable companies or a TV station or whatever, to require them to annually or periodically file not only an accessibility plan, but a progress report would enable us in the public, and if they file them and make them public, put them on a searchable database that any of us can go into and look at, would enable us to look at them and say, hey, they say they're doing X. I was just there last week. They're not. And make the enforcer's job easier. there should as well in the enforcement context. So crowdsourcing helps, and the more public be the reporting for their compliance, the more likely an organization is going to want to be sure that they're doing the right thing and getting it right. If a compliance self-report doesn't require you to just tick a box saying, yes, we're in compliance, but actually say what you're doing. If it has to be signed by the CEO and it has to be posted online, you're going to expect that CEO to ask a lot of tough questions of their staff before they sign it and agree to post it. To make enforcement work as well, one of the things that we've learned from the states is you need a dedicated public enforcement staff. We've also learned this from Israel. In the States, the U.S. Department of Justice has a disability rights section, and they have a substantial number of lawyers who could who could take on particular sectors, not just act on complaints, but decide that particular sectors of the economy need priority action and launch proceedings and try to negotiate solutions or litigate if they can't get settlements. Similarly, in Israel, not a big country, but trying to make progress in this area, they actually have more auditors and inspectors than we have under the Disability Act for the province of Ontario. They got way smaller population, way less territory, and from what I gather, a few other problems on their plate other than disability accessibility as compared to those of us in Ontario. We have fewer people to directors or inspection officials appointed under the Disabilities Act in Ontario to inspect larger territory, more people, and even though we are a more affluent society without the kind of security issues that a country in the Middle East has to deal with. So the other thing I want to talk about in terms of enforcement is, as a core principle, is that a couple of other things actually. Organizations are more likely to do the right thing if they are expecting government to come their way and check them out. And to that end, it's important, however many officials government actually hires to do this, it's a big country, Canada. We need to proliferate the public face of this legislation beyond the number of inspectors the government hires to deal with the federally reachable sector. How do you do that? Well, a proposal we've offered in Ontario, they've experimented with but never publicly reported on how it worked, was we proposed the government should deputize people who are doing enforcement and inspection functions under other regulatory laws to also have a mandate to do inspections and enforcement under the Disabilities Act. So if I can use the provincial example, if the government has whatever number of appointed inspectors under the Disabilities Act, but if they also appoint any elevator inspector or any food inspector or any occupational health and safety inspector, you just give them a checklist of 5 things to look for. It doesn't have to be everything. But if any company knows or any employer knows that when one of those inspectors comes in the door, they're going to have a Disability Act checklist, they're more likely to want to make sure that their operations are shipshape. But the other thing about, and that relates to what I describe as the public face, the sort of face presence of the Disabilities Act and the expectation you need to comply. But the other thing is not just how many people are out there doing the inspecting or auditing or whatever, but what they're inspecting. Now let me draw a contrast for you. In Israel, small country, the inspectors for the Disability Rights Commission actually go out on premises and look to see whether the premises of a place meets the actual accessibility standard, whether there are actual barriers. And if there are, they either they work with them to come into compliance or file proceedings, which the government then brings. Folks with disabilities in Israel say not enough of them and so on, but as I said, they got more boots on the ground doing this in Israel than we've got in Ontario. In Ontario, much of the auditing process is not going out on site at all, but rather asking organizations under the Ontario law, whether the obligated organization has the paper trail on accessibility they're supposed to. Do you have a policy? Well, send us a copy. Doesn't matter if you're implementing it, but do you have a policy? Did you train your staff on it? Send us your training records. And if your records are inadequate, from what we've been able to find out through freedom of information activities, again, ably assisted by Osgood public interest placement students helping us out, what we're finding out is far more often than should be the case, it looks to us like the enforcement is all about making sure your paper trail looks better. And if you send better paper in, they'll tell you you're in compliance. I'm not saying this is all the time, but it looks like it's a significant part of what they're doing. And for us, having good paper in your filing cabinet is not what it's all about, as if people have paper in filing cabinets anymore. What it's all about is actually removing barriers, finding out what people are actually doing to ensure that people with disabilities can fully participate in the workplace, and so on, and in the goods and services and organizations providing. So we say that the audit and inspection process has to go far further and must focus on what's actually being done to make a place accessible, not just the process paper trail. Well, the final thing I'm going to tell you about enforcement, because there's other goodies to offer you, is there is two concepts that have underpinned the Ontario implementation that may at first seem intuitively sensible, but have been an abject failure and shouldn't be replicated federally. The first is that the federal government should be required to bring itself into compliance before any other sector should. And the second is that we should first educate obligated organizations before we take enforcement. We have to first wait till they know all of what they got to do before we take enforcement. Now, at first, this seems intuitively sensible. It has been a complete, utter failure. Let me tell you why. First, the idea that the federal government should go first only makes sense if you've got really rapid compliance timelines. What's happened in Ontario is they gave the provincial government like 3 years to comply with an accessibility standard on customer service, and then gave the private sector another 2 years. What happened? The private sector, from what we could see, did nothing, for the most part, until about 4 years and 10 or 11 months into the process, and then suddenly rushed to comply. And in fact, the compliance under the customer service standard in Ontario was so, what you had to do to comply was so minimal, you only needed a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months if you're big. But rather than getting everybody doing it, could you imagine a law that says, private sector, you can keep polluting till the government stops? Well, please, don't give me any of that water to drink. Okay, I mean, that just makes no sense. Barriers, everybody should be working to remove barriers. It may be that some organizations have more capacity to do it, and therefore we expect them to move more quickly, but we shouldn't let organizations in any sector stall and delay for years because first we got to wait for government to do it. Not only that, but there are some areas where the private sector is better able to move more quickly. In fact, the usual expectation in Ontario that we've seen from the government is first the government, then large business, then finally small business who get the most time. Now, sometimes that makes sense. And of course, the expectations of smaller business can be less. But I'm going to give you an example, a really important example, where small business can actually move way more quickly and should have shorter timelines. What is that? Website accessibility. Principally in the area of website accessibility, we're talking about making content accessible predominantly on a go-forward basis. So making sure your new content, try to fix up your overall web presence, but then just principally devote your efforts to what you're posting that's new. Well, if you're a small organization with just a few employees, your website might be fixed in hours, maybe a few days. In contrast, the government of Ontario is a huge organization with a massive web presence. Now, telling that smaller business, you don't have to do anything until the Ontario government fixes their monstrous web presence, I mean, it's counterproductive. It's really wrong, but that's how we've worked. Don't recommend it. Well, let me jump from enforcement to other areas where the federal government can make a huge difference if the Disabilities Act is designed properly. The next major area I want to talk to you about is the magic topic of government money. And the proposition I want to put before you is one of principle that turns into one of very powerful practice if it's done right. The principle is this: not one dime of government money should ever be used to create new barriers or perpetuate existing ones against people with disabilities. How do you turn that into practice? You look at every opportunity that the federal government has where it spends money and you attach strings to it. You want federal money? Well, you got to show that you will not be creating barriers or perpetuating existing ones when you get that money. Attaching accessibility strings is a powerful avenue for change for two reasons. One, the government spends a ton of money and others want it. They don't have enough money to give everyone who wants it, whether it's in the various avenues I'm going to describe. There are competitors to get that money. So government's in the position to call the tune. And the second reason is doing this doesn't cost the government anything other than its implementation and enforcement costs. The advantage of this is this will put pressure on the public and private sectors to create more and more accessibility, not through the traditional regulatory tools, but simply by the motivation of wanting to get or keep access to government money. So what kind of government money am I talking about? Let me give you some examples. Number one, capital and infrastructure money. The federal government, like the provincial government, spends oodles, not only on its own federal infrastructure, federal offices and so on, but on grants to municipalities and provinces and public transit authorities to build public transit, university buildings, hospitals, and so on. Attaching strong accessibility strings. You want our money? Your hospital, wherever it is in Canada, is going to have to meet the standards that we, the federal government, set. Won't cost the government any money. You don't want to meet our standards? We'll give it to somebody who will. Second, the federal government spends oodles of money on procuring goods and services for federal programs, either by use by the government or by the public. If the government should attach strong accessibility strings that provides that we will buy your goods and services or use your facilities only if you meet our accessibility requirements or will remediate them to meet our accessibility requirements. An example, just one example. If the federal government is going to hold a conference, is going to fund a conference, it should be in a location, a hotel or conference venue, that meets federal accessibility requirements. I've had the privilege of speaking at a number of them that don't. And to me, that just seems ridiculous. But it wouldn't cost the federal government anything to say, you know what, we got to rent a hotel. We're just going to go to one down the street that's better on accessibility. And if they get the word out, and they get the word out loud and clear, the hotel sector and the hospitality sector is sure going to want to clean up its act because the federal government is one heck of a good customer. Won't cost the federal government anything, and yet it will spawn more accessibility to the private sector. Let me give you just two other examples. The federal government gives out a lot of money in research grants, in business development grants and loans. It could attach accessibility strings to those. You want a grant to help develop your business in some sector of the economy? You got to ensure you've got an accessible workplace and that the products and goods and services you're going to sell are themselves accessible. Otherwise, we'll give our money to an applicant who will. The other example is federal transfer payments. The federal government transfers lots of money to its transfer partners, healthcare being one stellar example, attaching accessibility strings to that. They've attached other strings. In fact, look at the Canada Health Act. It calls for the accessibility of universal accessibility of healthcare, but they don't use the word accessibility there the way we use it in the disability context. But why the heck don't they? We've learned from the US that stronger action in the area of attaching strings to federal money can make a real difference. And I would go further than just federal money. I would go to money from federally regulated organizations where possible. That can make a huge difference. And finally, to make this work, there are ways to make this way more effective and efficient. If you just did what I just said, it would be great. But it would require ministry after ministry and company after company within the federal sphere and recipients of federal money to again and again have to reinvent the accessibility wheel to figure out what they have to do. What's the solution? Two things I've already talked about. Number one, accessibility standards. And number two, monitoring, auditing, and enforcement. Accessibility standards could provide details on what accessibility we expect in the goods or services we procure, or in the hospital you're going to build, or university building, or whatever it may be. So obligated organizations know what they're getting themselves into. The federal government knows what they're demanding. Auditing and inspecting for this will motivate recipients of federal money to make sure they live up to the commitments that are expected of them. If you just attach the strings, but you don't pull on that string by auditing or monitoring and imposing effective consequences for noncompliance, then this will all be window dressing too much of the time. The advantage of what I'm talking about is manifest. If a large enough organization like the federal government or a cluster of organizations like the airlines and the phone companies and cable companies collectively were demanding accessible products, the private sector that makes those products wants their business and is going to produce more accessible products. And as a result of that, we win all around. Those industries or vendors make more money with more sales. We, people with disabilities, have access to a broader range of products. And governments and federally regulated industries get the benefit of being able to provide more effectively for their employees and customers with disabilities. It's a total win-win. Nobody loses. So that, the entire, but just what we've learned in Ontario, the Ontario government, to its credit, has said, Premier Wynne wrote in a letter to me as chair of my provincial coalition in the last provincial election that the government will not use provincial money to create or perpetuate barriers. Fantastic commitment. Problem? No overall scheme for ensuring it takes place, no monitoring that we've seen, and we've found significant violations of it. If you want to go to the YouTube, search on the name Lepofsky and Ryerson, and you'll see a video of a new building just opened a couple of years ago at Ryerson University with provincial money, the Ryerson Student Learning Center, with significant accessibility problems. Significant accessibility problems. And that's not unique to Ontario. So the tool or the lever of federal money has enormous potential, but it must be effectively deployed, not just with broad commitments, but with real concrete action. So what else could you? Already I've given you enough to fill a national accessibility law, no problem. But believe it or not, there is still more. Let me turn to another general area, and that is what I would call pulling all the levers of federal power. We need the national accessibility law to require the federal government to find, locate, and put its hands on all the levers of federal power that can help it advance the accessibility agenda. And this is all to be done in a sort of sensible way, not just, we know they've got a million other things to do. So the idea is look for levers of power that you can pull effectively with results and without needing to run up the deficit in some crazy way in order to achieve it. Several suggestions. For the reasons I outlined earlier, we need a minister in the cabinet who leads the implementation of this law at a regulatory side, and we need a minister who is ultimately responsible for ensuring the government's in compliance. The federal government and large government organizations should be required, for reasons I described earlier, in case of large organizations, to have a chief accessibility officer. A proposal that we put to the province of Ontario, to its credit, in each ministry has what they call an accessibility lead to help the ministry comply. The problem is they're buried way too far within the organization to have an impact. They should be elevated up to report to a deputy minister. Same employee, but just more clout and requisite expertise, we would hope. The federal government should have other requirements that are distinctive to it. It's the largest organization by far. It should be required to promulgate a multi-year plan on how it's going to get us from here to the deadline of full accessibility. And it should be required to make that plan public and then to annually report on progress and declare whether in its view, we're on schedule or behind schedule. What we've done in Ontario was, to their credit, is to have multi-year plans. But not to their credit, they're just multi-year plans, like a 5-year plan on how far we're going to get in 5 years, without requiring them to look at the ultimate deadline of 2025 and say, is your plan going to get you on schedule, keep you on schedule for achieving that goal for full accessibility? A few other things that we've learned from the Ontario experience, both good and bad. The process of developing and amending legislation is a unique kind of process. And in the process of developing legislation, the same problem I illustrated at the start of this lecture has too often pervaded. Laws tend to be written as if they are for the so-called average person, who is a person who has no disability. Obviously, we have specialty laws that focus on special education or paratransit or whatever, but they're the exception. Generally, laws are written on the assumption that the people to whom they apply have no disability, which is kind of makes no sense because everybody either has a disability or gets one later. So how do you fix this? Well, the old-fashioned way is, let's just do charter litigation against every statute out there. Well, people with disabilities can't afford it. And for government, that's kind of like the least productive way to spend their time. Of course, we have to have resort to charter litigation. But what we need is all laws to be reviewed to see if they meet accessibility needs. Not just whether they, on their face, select people with disabilities for worse treatment, but further, looking at the laws and the programs they authorize or require, to see whether the legislation effectively ensures that people with disabilities can fully participate in them. I co-authored an article some years ago, which I'll link to this lecture, or at least the name to which I'll link to this lecture, which explains how you develop or review legislation based on principles of universal design for ensuring accessibility for people with disabilities. Well, governments don't do this right now, so what do you need the federal government to do? Review all federal legislation and regulations over a period of time. The statute should set a deadline for doing it, and then bring forward an omnibus bill to fix the legislation where needed. What's been the Ontario experience? Commendably, 11 years ago, the Premier of Ontario, Dalton McGuinty, promised such a review. Not so commendably, 11 years later, they've only reviewed 51 or 55 of 750 statutes, and the amendments they made missed many, many important barriers. And there's no end in sight. We need a legislative deadline that will bring this legislative review into clearer compliance. This will save everybody trouble. It will avoid the need to do charter litigation and make for more effective laws. The next need that I'd like to highlight, or next lever of power that I'd like to suggest, is available and important is a immediate review of the accessibility of the election process at the federal sphere. Right now, voters with disabilities face too many barriers when they try to exercise their democratic franchise during a federal election. We still face too many at the provincial and municipal levels, but if I could give you the town of Cobourg as an example, if you are blind, as am I, and you can't mark a print ballot, your choices are either at the municipal level, telephone or internet voting, the most independent way for you to vote. Provincially, there is one accessible voting machine in every riding, and you can only use it up to elect voting day, but not on voting day. And you've got to schlep across the riding to the one place where that will be in your riding. And federally, we have neither of those. Federally, we mark a federal ballot. There have been some efforts to address the federal ballot, but none that enable me to mark my ballot in private, independently, and verify my choice without requiring any sighted assistance. That's just one illustration of the kind of barriers we need to fix. And a voter is a voter is a voter, whether they're in a municipal or provincial or federal election. There really is no reason for them to face different barriers at different levels. The final lever of federal power I want to draw on just now as an illustration is the power of Canada's activity in the area of international trade. Government after government, regardless of the political stripe, devotes federal resources to promoting Canadian products and Canadian services on the international stage. Government delegations that go off to one country or another, touring around, bringing a plane full of business folks to promote Canadian wares abroad. Nothing against doing that. But guess what, folks? How many customers are there around the world with disabilities? The answer is upwards of 1 billion. And yet we do not have, to my knowledge, any federal government strategy to ensure that our international trade activities try to get our Canadian private sector to meet that incredible demand. The demand for accessible goods and services around the world is growing, especially because any number of countries have passed accessibility laws, and more are considering doing so. So the country that decides that they want to grab the market for accessible goods and services to serve 1 billion people around the world is going to have a huge advantage. A national accessibility law should grab that lever of power too, and provide that whatever the government is going to do to promote Canadian trade around the world, Canadian products around the world, should include this as a core component. This should be a moneymaker for Canada. Indeed, it ought to be a moneymaker for the federal government if they do it effectively in terms of generating new tax revenues. Let me spend our last few minutes together just offering you a few under sundry practical things that would make a national accessibility law work. I've been talking a lot about legal tools and standards and enforcement and all that stuff, and they're really important. But for an obligated organization, whether it's the federal government or some recipient of federal money or a federally regulated company, they also need help. And they're going to want to know just not only what they have to do, but they want help in how to do it. And there are several things that the federal government could do at low cost and make a huge difference. Before I mention them, I want to reiterate that well-written, strong and effective accessibility standards can themselves be a really good help. Because if they tell an obligated organization's CEO or key officials what they've got to do, without them having to hire lawyers and accessibility consultants to know what they have to do, they're more likely to do it, It's going to make it easier for them to do it. It's going to make it lower cost for them to do it. And they're therefore going to find them to be a help in doing it. But that's not all. That's before we even turn to more proactive tools for help. One thing we've learned from the United States is that providing reliable, arm's length advice for free to obligated organizations can really help. And the US has done this by establishing a network of technical advisory offices around the country. Cleverly, they're not part of the Department of Justice or whatever, so that if a company calls them up for technical advice, they don't have to worry that your call is being recorded for quality assurance and the recording is going to be used in evidence against you in a non-compliance proceeding. I wouldn't blame any company for not wanting to call for advice if they worried that what they would ask could get used against them. Moreover, the US has established an excellent service called the Job Accommodation Network, or JAN, which provides advice both to employers and employees. Again, it's over the phone or whatever advice, and therefore companies still have to do what they're supposed to do, but they pick up a phone, place a call, get some good advice on what needs to be done or on some helpful solutions, and it solves a problem. Think of the enforcement costs we've saved. Think of the capacity to increase compliance. So that can help. This could be easily supplemented by online resources. My worry about government online resources is not that they can't be helpful, but because in the modern day of government, at least from the third of a century I worked there, there's been an increasing kind of nervous Nelly thing going on about worrying about putting anything out that might lead someone to be upset about why are you asking us to do that. Now that's not to say governments don't put out useful resources or can't, but there is a reluctance. I will tell you that in 2011, Ontario passed its first package of comprehensive accessibility standards in the areas of transportation, employment, and information communications, and it took them about 12 or 13 months before they even put any online help out at all. And the work had been done much earlier, but just the bureaucratic process of getting things online and approved and whatever, we need something that breaks that logjam. We can't just rely on that. I've talked up till now about the federal sphere, and it would seem at first that the federal government shouldn't go any further. But in fact, I believe it should. And there are significant ways that the federal government can influence accessibility within provincial jurisdiction without violating provincial jurisdiction. Let me tell you first why we should care, and then second, how to do it. Why we should care is this. Canada's Constitution devolves responsibility for many, probably most of the barriers facing people with disabilities to provincial and not federal jurisdiction. So if we left it to the provinces to solve this problem, we would mostly end up with an inadequate solution because it would require all provinces to pass their own provincial accessibility laws. So far in the past 13 years, only 3 have. A couple are looking at it, but only 3 have. And secondly, the second problem is it burdens smaller provinces like Prince Edward Island or Newfoundland with the burden of trying to replicate a lot of the heavy lifting work that a more populated and resourced province like Ontario can more readily deploy. From the point of view of people with disabilities, we'd like to go anywhere in the country and know we're going to get basic accessibility. From the point of view of obligated organizations, they'd like to know that if there's one standard they meet somewhere in the country, that they don't have to worry about learning 9 other standards elsewhere in the country. So there's a strong interest on the part of everybody to have a more national presence, even in the areas that the provinces are responsible for. Now, normally, when you say something like I just said, provincial rights buffs are all going to get all worried about, isn't this going to invade provincial jurisdiction? No, there's a couple of ways to do it that doesn't invade that jurisdiction at all. Here they are. First, think that it would be really helpful if the national body that is responsible for creating national accessibility standards in the federal sphere should also have a mandate to create model accessibility standards for the provincial sphere. These would, of course, not be mandatory. If they passed a national accessibility standard on healthcare, it would not be binding in those aspects of the healthcare system which are exclusively the responsibility of the provinces. However, if the federal government passed a national accessibility standard on healthcare, it would be open to provinces to opt into it if they wished. So if PEI decided, we don't want to create the whole standards development process that Ontario has, but the feds have created a good one, let's just take it off the shelf and adopt it and enact it, we could get action in PEI because PEI decided it wanted to take that action. The advantage of a national model standard as well is that if you're a business carrying on business across the province, across the country, you may well aim to comply with that national model standard, even if you're doing business in provincial areas of regulatory jurisdiction. If you were to know that complying with the federal standard ensures that you fulfill the requirements under a provincial access law, like the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, and provincial human rights codes. For them, it would be effective one-stop shopping. So model national accessibility standards are, again, a win-win situation. Province doesn't like them, doesn't have to adopt it. But if they like it, they can adopt it or they can add to it. We have an example to draw on. The federal government has a national building code. It does not govern buildings that are in provincial jurisdiction, but provinces use it often as a basis for their own building codes. I'm drawing on that example. Second suggestion. I've proposed just a few minutes ago that the federal government develop helpful resources like technical assistance call-in lines or a job accommodation network. It would be worthwhile to let the federal government invite provincial governments to opt into it and use it within provincial jurisdiction. So your company can call in for advice whether you're federally regulated or provincially. My third suggestion is one I've actually already covered with you. A few minutes ago, I talked to you about attaching strings, accessibility strings, when the federal government gives out money. Well, a significant chunk of the money the federal government gives out is to projects that are within provincial jurisdiction. Some university buildings, public transit, hospitals, and so on. If the federal government attaches accessibility strings to those, they're helping tear down or prevent barriers in the provincial area without violating provincial constitutional jurisdiction. Because it's always open to the provincial folks who want to build a hospital to say, sorry, we don't want to obey your strings. We're not going to take your federal money. So just by those examples, I've shown ways that the federal government could have a significant impact. And what I'm hoping those kind of activities by the federal government will do was help lead the other 7 provinces that don't have now a provincial accessibility law to decide that it makes sense to harmonize it all and to have one as well. Let me talk just for a moment about a couple of closing things and then let me wrap up. It is really important for another ingredient of this law to include important measures to ensure accountability for those who implement this law. Because it's important to give a roadmap. It's important to have enforcement, but there's a number of key players who've got to be accountable because they're overseeing how the whole system works. Let me offer you just a few ideas. First, the National Accessibility Commissioner I've talked about, the Canada Accessibility Commissioner, whatever they want to call it, I've already suggested it should have 2 jobs: developing recommendations for access standards and enforcement. Let me suggest a third. It should also be our national conscience, our national watchdog, our national champion that speaks out on these issues and lets us know where we need to do better. Second, what we've learned in Ontario very well is that it's very helpful if an accessibility law like this puts in place a requirement to independently take our temperature every once in a while. The Ontario's accessibility law, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, it requires the Ontario government after the first 4 years under the Act and then every 3 years after to appoint an independent person to conduct consultations and then report to the government on how effectively the law is working. In effect, are we on schedule for reaching full accessibility by 2025? And if it's falling short, to make recommendations. We've had 2 of these independent reviews, one in 2010, one in 2014, and the next one needs to be appointed as of the day I'm speaking to you within the next 3 weeks as a matter of law. These have been really important. They point out where we're doing well, but they also point out where significant change is made. They don't guarantee that change will be made, but for those of us who've been involved in the advocacy in this area, they've been an important way not only to hold the government accountable, but to find where there's actually consensus on this subject as between people with disabilities and obligated organizations. They've found often that the same message is coming from both sides, asking the government to do more in one area or another. And finally, in terms of accountability, there needs to be mechanisms in the law in place in circumstances where the government is just not doing something it's supposed to do. We shouldn't have to resort to legal proceedings like mandamus. They're fraught with legal complications. They cost a lot. In the year 2014, the government was obliged to appoint the independent review by May 31st, 2014. Excuse me, 2013, I misspoke. Required to appoint them by May 31st, 2013. The Ontario government didn't do so. It broke its own law. And it took 100 days or more till it appointed that independent reviewer. Eventually appointed Mayo Moran, then the Dean, University of Toronto Faculty of Law, a great choice. But about 3 months were lost, and it's completely inexcusable. There should be a summary process when an important clear obligation is there on the government in its role as leading us to full accessibility to be held accountable if it isn't obeying its own law. The final area I want to touch on before we close is the area of initial steps. Everything I've talked about, if the federal government listened to everything I said and said, all good ideas, let's do it. The day they enact it, nothing's going to change. Not because anybody's bad, but setting up this new regime is going to take some time. Of course it will. And once it's set up, getting recommendations for access standards is going to take some time. And then enacting them is going to take some time. And then we face the prospect that we'll be told, oh, you have to wait for people to get properly educated on them before we can take enforcement. Earlier I said that proposition doesn't work. It doesn't work because if you do, or it isn't necessary, because if you do an effective job of developing access standards, then the obligated sectors know what's coming well before it's enacted. And if you do have a well-designed enforcement process, the first step of enforcement is visiting or contacting the organization saying, here's what you got to do. Have you done it? And if they say no, you give them a compliance order and timelines. That's education. You don't need to have seminars before you get there, especially for large organizations like the federal government and large federally regulated companies who are well positioned to know what they're supposed to do. So but we do need something in place to get things changing on the ground for people with disabilities right away or quickly while all this new regulatory machinery is created. What do? Simple. Start immediately to attach strings to federal money. Starting the day after the law passes, tell those who want to receive federal money for grants or loans or infrastructure payments or sell goods or services that this is the new way we're doing business. The moment they actually say that, things will start changing. Whether they give people a grace period, understandable if they would, nevertheless, things will start changing. And you don't need a new regulatory regime to get that change to start. Let me conclude where I began. 36 years ago, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau embarked us on an amazing journey when he spearheaded the creation of the Charter of Rights and when he accepted our proposal that Charter of Rights should guarantee equality to people with disabilities. We think that today, 36 years later, and with all the experience since then, his son, Justin Trudeau, is similarly uniquely positioned to make that dream a reality, to draw on the experience of countries in many parts of the world who are now ahead of us, and to catapult us ahead of all other countries in the world by putting us in the position to put in a regulatory regime that will take us from being behind to leading all others on the road to full accessibility. Thank you very much. I welcome the chance to take your questions.